have a free press here. But it was so, you know, if you're really a scholar and you got a terrific memory, you can remember that something unpleasant happened there, but it's certainly not an issue. We don't look into the question. Nobody calls for freedom of the press in El Salvador, and for two very good reasons. For one thing, Washington, the Office of Public Diplomacy, has ordered us that that topic is off the agenda. We're not supposed to talk about that, so therefore, being loyal cowards, we naturally obey, so that's one reason. The other reason is that to call for a free press in El Salvador would be ridiculous. You can't have a free press in El Salvador without first dismantling the whole terror system that the United States installed precisely to ensure that you can't have things like a free press, or for that matter, Bible study groups that might turn into peasant self-help groups, and in fact, all the developments that caused Washington to unleash the terror apparatus. So since it's absurd to ask for a free press, I guess there's no point in doing so. In any event, no one asks about it. Meanwhile, I should say in Nicaragua, nothing remotely comparable has happened. The opposition claims harassment, and of course it always hits the front pages of the newspapers, but they're not expecting to be murdered or tortured. And this opposition is extreme. It's the kind of opposition which has never survived in a Western democracy in times of crisis. La Prensa, for example, and the groups around it, are openly support the U.S. attack against Nicaragua. Nothing secret about it. I just had the, I guess, I'm not sure it's happy experience, but experience of reading 3 months' worth of La Prensa. I must be the only person outside the CIA who actually has all of La Prensa since the time was opened in my office at home. And it's just openly pro-Contra. It doesn't even hide it. You know? It's simply a U.S. government disinformation organ. I mean, to allow the journal to publish, it's as if in the United States during the Second World War, the media were largely dominated by Japanese fascist journals calling for the overthrow of the U.S. government and the liberation of, you know, the territories in the Pacific from the racist murderers in the United States or something like that. I mean, such things are inconceivable. You know, they never happen in the West. And the same is true of what we call the opposition, which openly identifies with the U.S. attack against Nicaragua and regards the U.S. as their only basic political support. Well, they do get harassed, and, you know, they get censored and that sort of thing. They don't get murdered. In El Salvador, there's nothing even remotely similar. It's not like the press knows all of this, but will never report any of it. Inconceivable that they report these things, though every journalist in Managua and San Salvador knows it. Again, nobody is talking about the application of the terms of the Accords, which would permit an opposition, even a mild opposition, to function. Nobody's talking about those conditions. In El Salvador, that's off the agenda. And in general, all the simultaneity requirements are unacceptable because they would require the dismantling of the terror apparatus that the United States took such pains to impose and still supports. Now, another feature of the Accords that's unacceptable was international verification. The Accords had in them a provision for verification, an international verification commission, which included the 5 Central American countries, the Latin American democracies, the Contadora countries, the OAS, the Organization of American States, and the United Nations. Well, plainly that's unacceptable, essentially for the reasons I just mentioned. International verification would put barriers in the way of the U.S. attack against Nicaragua and the U.S. attack against the populations of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras via the terrorist apparatus, the military regimes, which were either imposed or supported for that purpose. So that's unacceptable. Another reason why international verification is unacceptable to the United States is that the Latin American countries, though dependent, of course, on the United States, after all, we are the 800-pound gorilla, they're dependent on the United States, and there are limits beyond which they can go. Nevertheless, they have a degree of independence. They have a degree of independence, and therefore they're not allowed in at all. In fact, nobody with a degree of independence from the master of the hemisphere is allowed in. So plainly, international verification has to go. And in fact, the demolition job on the Accords was completed by January. By January, the simultaneity condition was thrown out, international verification was terminated, and in fact, nothing remains of the Accords. They are finished. They are part of ancient history. Nothing remains of the Guatemala City Accords. The press may talk about the Arias Accords and so on, but either they're lying consciously or else they're unwilling to bother to look. The fact of the matter is there is nothing left of those Accords. What is left is a version of the Accords written in Washington and transmitted by the press and accepted by Congress, And that version says Nicaragua has to accede to arbitrary demands stated by the United States government, whatever they happen to be. That's the Accords. And that's all there is left of them. There's nothing left of the original text. Well, what were the means used to destroy the Accords? This is a very successful demolition job. What were the means used? Well, there were two kinds. There were military means and there were ideological means, you might say. The military means were, first of all, and most important, the intensification of the CIA supply flights. That was the most important event that happened during August to January. As I mentioned, the supply flights, which of course illegal to start with, were sharply intensified to about 2 to 3 a day, and also U.S. surveillance flights, which we have a very extensive surveillance apparatus, all the fanciest SR-71s and U-2s and satellites and spy ships off the coast and so on, are carrying out intensive surveillance of Nicaragua, and that was extended too. Now, both of those operations are significant. The supply flights are crucial, in fact critical, because, as is recognized on all sides of this debate, the Contras, the proxy army, are not guerrillas. They have no remote relation to guerrillas. The KGB doesn't fly 2 to 3 supply flights a day into El Salvador to keep the guerrillas in the field. And nobody's talking about sending humanitarian aid to the guerrillas. You don't have to, because they're part of the country. They're rooted in the country. They fight inside their own country. They've got their own network of support. In fact, the reason for U.S. terror in El Salvador has been to try to destroy that base of support. But they don't need supplies. They don't have to get, but the Contras, on the other hand, have to get everything from food to fancy communication equipment to boots to arms and so on, because they're not part of the country. They're a foreign implant. That's what it means to say. In fact, nobody really denies this is not a topic for debate. You know, the Reagan administration is the first ones to tell you that this force is going to collapse unless we continue to provide them with arms and supplies. The meaning of that, which they don't bother to tell you in the press, but you can figure it out, the meaning of that is they're not guerrillas, because nobody does this for guerrillas. And in fact, that's written into the Accords. It's well understood in Central America. You take a look at the actual wording of the Accords, and they say that the indispensable element for peace in the region is an end to any form of support. And then they mention military, logistical, propaganda, or whatever, to 2 kinds of groups, namely irregular forces and insurrectionist movements. Now, the distinction for that is that the irregular forces are the Contras, foreign organized forces attacking some country. The insurrectionist movements are indigenous guerrillas. And the indispensable element of the Accords is the termination of any form of support for them, any form, logistical or whatever, of course, as a corollary, the use of one country as a territory for insurrectionist movement, for irregular forces attacking another. In January, the International Commission, the Verification Commission, published its report. Now, that was plainly the most important thing that happened in January. Here's this commission made up of the 5 Central American countries and the Latin American democracies and OAS and the UN, had investigated all the countries. They finally came out with a report. Now we can finally get an independent, objective assessment of the compliance with the Guatemala City Accords. Well, it was mentioned in the New York Times. We have a free press. It got actually 1 sentence in the New York Times, buried in an article by James Lemoyne, in which he stated that the commission broke up in disagreement. Well, in fact, its report was unanimously accepted, but that was the total description in the news report on January 14th, when 15th, the report was issued on the 14th. Here and there you could find, the Chicago Tribune actually covered it in this case, but there was very little coverage. And you can see why. The conclusions of the commission were just not useful for ideological warfare. Why? Well, first of all, the commission denounced the United States. It singled out the United States and the United States alone for condemnation because the United States had undermined the indispensable element for peace in the region by continuing its support for the irregular forces attacking Nicaragua from Honduras, and in fact from Costa Rica. And that's the central condemnation in the Accords. Well, plainly that's useless. Now, the Commission went on to say that they couldn't provide detailed comments on the particular countries of the region, and the reason for that was that 3 countries objected: El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. The 3 U.S. terror states would not permit a description. You can figure out for yourselves what the description would have been, but the U.S. wouldn't allow it through its clients. It blocked any description of the. However, they did carry out have a press conference in Costa Rica, and there the delegates discussed, the Latin American representatives spoke openly at the press conferences of what they called, they said that they were shocked by the attitude of patent fear in the faces of opposition people and trade unionists in El Salvador and Guatemala, the two U.S. terror states. Well, plainly there's no point in reporting that. The Commission also praised Nicaragua for what they called concrete steps towards democratization despite the ongoing U.S. aggression. Well, that's plainly useless. In fact, none of this is useful for ideological warfare, so therefore it didn't happen. And the reporting is virtually zero in the New York Times, which is the most important newspaper. Worse than zero, one sentence which was a lie. The Commission plainly had to be disbanded, and the U.S. simply insisted that it be disbanded. The main U.S. client in the region, Jose Napoleon Duarte, who is a Democrat by definition because he follows U.S. orders, is also one of the worst murderers in the history of Latin America, and he's reviled and detested throughout Latin America for this region, but here he's very highly praised. He said with some insight, I think, that it wasn't really necessary to have an international commission of verification because he said the press would suffice for verification. That's quite right. That expresses a real insight into the workings of the press. Well, that took care of the International Verification Commission, so one element of the Accords, the basic element of the Accords, is gone, no more international supervision. Recognizing that the powerful make the rules and the weak just obey, Nicaraguan President Ortega then announced that Nicaragua would adhere to the conditions of the Accords alone.
A lot happened between the time of the speech by Noam Chomsky on the 3rd of March 1988 until about the 3rd of April when this videotape was made. March 1st, the Contras attacked a Nicaraguan village. March 2nd, the Republican Contra-Aid Plan was voted down. The next day, talks between the Nicaraguan government and Mosquito Indians began. On March 4th, the Democratic Contra-Aid Plan was voted down. 2 days later, there was an investigation of misuse of American funds in El Salvador. March 9th, negotiations between the Sandinistas and the Contras were canceled. The next day, the Contras released a captured American. The day after that, the Contras agreed with talks with Nicaragua. March 12th, Robert McFarland pled guilty to withholding Contra information from Congress. On the 15th, the Senate voted to force the president to inform them about covert operations. The next day, the Costa Rican president opposed Contra-Aid. Then the Big Four was indicted for conspiracy. The U.S. sent troops to the Honduran border, saying that Nicaragua had invaded, which Nicaragua denied. The next day, the troops did arrive from the United States, and the following day, Oliver North resigned. Duarte in El Salvador almost lost control of the National Assembly. The American troops moved within 15 miles of Nicaragua, and the Nicaraguan Contra talks reconvened. On the 24th, temporary truce between the Nicaraguans and the Contras was ironed out. All the heavies pleaded not guilty in the Contragate affair. March 28th, Nicaragua freed the prisoners under the ceasefire agreement, and the next day the negotiations began. On the 30th, Congress approved more Contra-Aid. April 1st, the ceasefire began in Nicaragua. The next day, the U.S. sent 1,300 troops to Panama. As of March 27th, 25,000 people have been killed in this American-sponsored Contra war against Nicaragua.
And there's a very good article in the Propaganda Review in the winter of 1988 that's the anatomy of a disinformation campaign that illustrates very well Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman's view of the media and the way they manufacture consent to certain conservative policies. What this article deals with is the way that the mass media presented the aftermath of an attempt to assassinate the Contra leader, Eden Pastora, that took place on May the 31st of 1981. Pastora was a Sandinista hero, a hero of the Nicaraguan Revolution, who went to Nicaragua with the Sandinistas after the revolution and was a major figure in the government. He then left Nicaragua because he thought they were becoming too closely involved with Cuba and the Soviet Union. So eventually Pastora joined the Contras and started engaging in fights against the Nicaraguan government to try to overthrow the Sandinistas. He got completely fed up with the other Contra forces, though, that were directed with the CIA. So on May the 31st of 1984, he called a press conference to denounce the other Contra leaders, to separate himself from them, and to renounce his Contra activity. At that press conference, a bomb went off that wounded many of the journalists there, that harmed Pastora and some of his Contra friends, and that killed some other journalists. Right after that bomb went off, ABC and PBS reported that the bomb was set off by a Basque ETA terrorist who was working for Nicaragua. The Basques are a mountain people in Spain who want an autonomous country free from Spain and from France, and had been engaged occasionally in armed struggle for Basque independence for many years. And what happened was a disinformation campaign was set up that was accusing so-called Basque terrorists of involving themselves in terrorism, in political assassinations and violence in Central America as surrogates of the Nicaraguan Contras. The source for this story was a former member of the El Salvador Liberation Group, who told the member of a Reagan group, the Office for Public Diplomacy, that the Basques were very active in terrorist activities in Central America. The Office of Public Diplomacy was a Reagan administration office that was the first state propaganda bureau that the U.S. government ever had. That is, an agency to create propaganda and disinformation for a very specific policy, which was that of the Reagan administration policy in Central America. So the Office of Public Diplomacy put out a report that they paid one of their employees to publish, that the Basques were very active in terrorism in Costa Rica, El Salvador, and other Central American countries. This had the first effect of souring the relationships between the Costa Rican government and the Sandinistas. All sorts of stories were leaked to Costa Rican newspapers at the time. The Costa Ricans were trying to get better relations with the Sandinistas, that the Sandinistas had sent terrorists to Costa Rica to carry out political assassinations, to bomb people in the Costa Rican government and the U.S. Embassy and the Contra forces there. And although there was no evidence ever that Basques were actually operative there, the stories were printed in Costa Rican newspapers. So after the Pastora attempt at his assassination, the bombing of Pastora, the Office of Public Diplomacy revealed documents about this Basque terrorist group and claimed that one of their top terrorists were there, who was the one that was attempting to assassinate Pastora, and that he was a Sandinista terrorist, and leaked this story out to the media. Well, ABC and PBS both picked this story up. They were dupes of disinformation. On June the 1st, ABC, on their World News Tonight reports, boldly stated that there is, quote, growing evidence that the Sandinistas have hired international hitmen from a Basque terrorist group known as the ETA to have Pastora killed. They then went into the whole details of the supposed Basque terrorist operations in Central America, and said that all the evidence points to this Basque hitman, and presented this as a Sandinista plot. which some people thought might be a prelude to a U.S. invasion of Nicaragua, as well as an attempt to create hostility and tension between the Costa Rican and the Sandinista government. Now, this is ironic because as it came out later, the guy that really did the assassination attempt of the Pastora was related to the John Hall, Oliver North, Richard Secord network. It later came out that this terrorist, whose picture was at the news conference, a well-known international terrorist, landed on John Hall's ranch, got explosives from Hall that were provided by Richard Secord, who was a top man in the North network, and that Hall gave him the explosives, gave him the false passport and press credentials to get into the press conference, and then helped him escape later. This came out in the Christic Institute's lawsuit, which began with the Lepenka bombing, because one of the plaintiffs in the Christic Institute suit was Tony Avignone and Martha Honey, who Tony was harmed in this bombing, and so he did research and pointed to John Hall's ranch. So all the leads pointed to John Hall.
Chomsky talks about other ways in which the media simply lie about things. For instance, he made a study of the Washington Post and the New York Times for January, February, March of 1987. He looked at all the editorials and found they were all anti-Sandinista. And he said, Chomsky said there are two very striking things about the Sandinista government compared to the other governments in Central America, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. One, that Sandinista government doesn't slaughter its own population, whereas the other three, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, have killed over 150,000 of their own citizens just in the 1980s. And second, that's never pointed out by the media, is that Nicaragua is the only one of those countries in which the government has tried to direct services to the poor and diverted resources for social reform and education. He said, well, Honduras is a little bit different from Guatemala and El Salvador. They don't kill so much, but they just let the rich rob the poor. So it's also very interesting, his analysis in another propaganda review, this in the winter of 1987-88. Chomsky says that very interesting things happened in the 1920s. He talked about even in World War I, a bunch of American historians offered themselves to President Woodrow Wilson, saying that they wanted to do some historical engineering so that they could get together and engineer the facts of history so that it would serve the state. And in 1921, the famous American journalist and pillar of the establishment, Walter Lippmann, said that democracy can exist only if there is manufacture of consent among the people. So you can see the problem democracies have. Soviet Union or totalitarian states, they say, by God, this is it, and we have state censorship. But you can't quite work with such a heavy hand in democracy. So what they have to do, they have to control what goes out, and they have to control what people think. So as Chomsky said, one of the ways to do this is to create a debate so that it looks like a lot of opinions are working. A lot of different information is coming in, but actually it's all working within a very narrow margin, a very narrow spectrum, all acceptable by the elites. Chomsky is one of the great intellectuals of our time, and yet, let's see, I saw him once with an interview with the guy from PBS.
Bill Moyers had a two-part interview series with Chomsky at the time that his book, Manufacturing Consent, came out. But he's hardly ever on the mainstream media, simply because he's such a radical critic of them. I might note that he's a very respectable professor at MIT. He's one of the experts in the field of linguistics. He's one of the top theorists of language and linguistic activity in the whole country. So he basically has two academic careers, as a researcher and critic of American foreign policy and the media, and as a specialist in the science of linguistics, where he's probably one of the most respected theorists in the entire world, for that matter.
Here's an example of what the establishment does to Chomsky, as well as not letting him on TV. He's been forced to publish most of his work with small circulation presses because the big mainstream mass circulation organizations won't do it. They almost did once back in the early 70s. Warner Modular Publications, which is a subsidiary of Warner Communications, signed a contract with Chomsky and Edward Herman to write a book called Counter-Revolutionary Violence, Bloodbaths in Fact and in Propaganda. Well, the manuscript was written and accepted. 20,000 copies of the book were printed. There were ads put out in the New York Review of Books. Promotional flyers were listed by the publisher. But the parent company, Warner, started sniffing around. And Warner's William Sarnoff, who was offended by the criticism of the U.S. government, ordered that the publication not take place. Well, the president of the Warner subsidiary, Claude McCaleb, protested this and tried to work out a compromise so that they could do it, but Warner was interested only in getting rid of the book. And they not only got rid of the book, they got rid of Claude McCaleb, the president of the subsidiary. Then they did away with the subsidiary.
Usually they don't put ideology over finances. Obviously they lost a lot of money that they'd paid Chomsky in advance for the book. They printed 20,000 copies, so they must have lost, hundreds of thousands of dollars. But the book was such an explosive indictment of U.S. foreign policy that they just didn't want to publish it. South End Press eventually published it in 2 volumes. I think it was called The Washington Connection. It basically is a study of state terrorism sponsored by the CIA, the way that the CIA has supported state terrorism. For instance, in Indonesia, in the 1960s, the CIA engineered an overthrow of a democratically elected government, and hundreds of thousands of leftists were killed in Indonesia in this project sponsored by the CIA. Later in East Timor, one of the Indonesian island chains, the Indonesian government, working with the CIA, carried out a bloodbath there of state terrorism that, again, the CIA was involved in. And they went through Vietnam, they went through Central America, all the ways that the United States government, and particularly the CIA, have supported state terrorism. This was just too explosive a book for Warner's to publish, so they just covered it over.
The incident created a big furor in France. They reported quite a bit about it, but not in the United States. This is blatant censorship there. That brings us to the end of another Alternative Views. We'd like to thank some people who made this production possible. Our cameraman was Eric Eubank, audio person Kevin L. West, and our assistant editor, Christy Swear. As usual, we are very grateful to Austin Community Television, ACTV. Alternative Views is a production of the Alternative Information Network, P.O. Box 7279, Austin, Texas 78713. We'll leave this little sign up here on for a while so you can jot it down. If you'd like to write to us, Alternative Information Network, P.O. Box 7279, Austin, Texas 78713. Goodbye.